Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Culture's Compass. This is our final panel, and I might say we've saved the best for last. We are going to be talking for the next hour about value in the arts. I am Jennifer Gordon. I am the director for both Humber's Center for Creative Innovation, Center for Creative Business Innovation, as well as Humber Galleries. Verbal description of myself. Middle-aged white woman wearing glasses, silver hairs up in a bun, and I'm wearing a pale blue blouse. I will hand the floor to each of my very esteemed colleagues here for them to introduce themselves briefly, and then I'll give a little overview of the panel and we'll dig right in. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Olivia.
Anin, hello, Olivia Shortt Indigenous Cause, North Bay Adonjaba, Visho Nipissing. I am a Toronto-based artist from Nipissing First Nation, and I have a wide and wild background. I have done everything from be a tour guide in New York City to be a producer in theater, and the last few years I've been focusing on being a freelance artist in music and theater and video art. So that's a little bit about me, and I will pass it to Robin.
Thanks, Olivia. My name is Robin Sokoloski. I go by she, her, Elle. I'm joining you today from Toronto, Takaranto, in Treaty 13 territory. I am currently the Director of Organizational Development for a national arts research organization called Mass Culture. Before that, I was working for quite some time at the Playwrights Guild of Canada, and I'm also an alum of the Humber Arts Management Program, a very proud alum. So it's really nice to be here to join all of you today. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Robin. It is such a pleasure to be here again with Humber College. My name is Kate, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am also zooming in from the east end of Toronto, Takaranto, Toronto Purchase territory. And I have worked in the arts on and off for about 20 plus years. And right now I'm actually working more broadly in the charitable sector as the interim director of public policy and advocacy for Imagine Canada. And if you don't know Imagine Canada, we are the national association representing the charitable and nonprofit sector. And I'm going to try and do a description like Jennifer did, because I thought that was really great. I am also a middle-aged woman, shoulder-length brown hair, wearing glasses and a light blue shirt, but not exactly the same color as Jennifer's. Thank you.
Thanks all. And yes, I'm coming to everyone from Treaty 13 territory as well. So let's get rolling here with our discussion on value in the arts. It's really interesting given the previous two panels today dealt with space, access to space, and what was the meaning of place and where are we placing value on who builds communities where and how. And then the panel before that was with three amazing municipal speakers who were discussing cultural policy, lack thereof, where it's ranked, how it's centered or not centered in most cases, and why. So this panel, we are going to riff off of some of those ideas. And we're talking about a conversation here, there's always this headbutting between arts and finance. How do you fit arts into a financial world? What are different forms of impact that, in terms of sustainable pathways for artists and arts workers? How do we express those forms of impact or value, and how do we shift the dialogue around value? I have some very intense opinions on this. However, I am going to cede the ground to this amazing group who also, I'm sure, have some very intense thoughts on this. So the first question I'm going to pose, why is the arts industry insufficiently funded and supported, even though it has been shown to play a key part in fostering a healthy society in various areas such as education, wellness, and entertainment? I will turn the floor over to Olivia to answer that first.
Yeah, so I definitely come from a perspective of being a freelance artist from the last few years. And before that, as a producer, I was seeing the contracts and also how negotiations are done and at different organizations. And it's from that perspective, at least, like when you're looking at these different organizations and what their values are, I know that plays a huge part into like, it's just this like chain of command of things that happen where you see one set of values and how that gets transplanted into artists and how that gets transplanted forward. And, you know, it's the classic thing of, you're at a wedding and you're willing to pay for your catering, but you're not willing to pay for the string quartet who's performing. And so like, why is that our value system regarding the arts? Like, why do we value, you know, only the food that's being made, but not the art that's also being made? And it's like this difference of what is tangible and not tangible. So for me, at least, it's I've managed to work less with organizations who don't value their artists as much, or value even the internally. You can see very much like the way organizations internally treat their own administrators and how that, again, it's like this domino effect. And I think it keeps coming back, right? Like you look at the Ontario Arts Council and, you know, how much funding they get and who is in charge of that and who, you know, like what person in power in our government says yes or no to funding to different organizations. Because then it means like, well, if Ontario Arts Council, and I'm only using them as one example, but any arts council, to be honest, like if they're not being funded, then what does that mean for the artist? And it's, again, another domino effect. So it's just this like constant domino effect. And I want to pass it to Kate right now because we talked about this earlier, but I think there's a lot of really good points that Kate has to bring up kind of in correlation to this.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm like nodding my head. The Ontario Arts Council and what happened to the Indigenous Cultural Fund was absolutely horrific and is exactly as you said, symptomatic of what is valued and what is really almost ignored and are huge gaps in the system. And I'm going to put on my policy wonk hat. And I should have mentioned earlier that I had the absolute pleasure of teaching cultural policy in the arts management program at Humber in the fall. So for me, it begins back in the 50s with the Massey Report and the creation of the Canada Council, our federal funder, and what, as a foundational document, what the Massey Report did was value the big white flagship organizations and, to your point, Olivia, really valued organizations over individuals. And what that has done to our entire system means that there are huge systemic barriers that are colonialist, that are racist, that are misogynist, and that has seeped through the decades and through time in the way that our system is set up. And to return to the question, Jennifer, about like, why are we insufficiently funded? And you made a reference to, you know, education and healthcare as well. The arts, education, and healthcare are all deemed in economic systems as women's work, as female domain. And if you look at the data for our sector, the majority of our sector has workers who are working in precarious gig economy kind of jobs that are women, female identified, gender diverse workers. And then the top 20% are white identified, often males. We have this huge disproportionate balance within our sector. And I think that's part of the reason why we have been insufficiently funded throughout the decades. And I want to pass it over to Robin, because for me, this comes down to value of the arts and the value of the individual artist.
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that going back to this whole idea of Olivia brought up in terms of this domino effect and going all the way back, as Kate said, to the 1950s with the Massey report. And really, that was not an exercise in doing an assessment in valuing the arts, but rather what the arts could do to build a nation. And I think we need to remember that, and we don't, because we tend to use that as the Massey report still to this day, 70 years later, as a foundational cultural policy document that we lean heavily on, which Kate referenced, is that strongly favors institutions over artists, which really does a great disservice to us, because if we aren't centering artists in our conversations around cultural policy and what is value when we think of the arts, then we aren't really understanding what the value of the arts are and what the arts can do. So that's a major issue. Not to mention, within that Massey report, it's completely disregards Indigenous artists. So I think that's really important to mention. And still, until this day, we utilize that as a piece of foundational information to inform us. I do think that when it comes to, because Jennifer had said something at the very beginning about shifting the dialogue on value. I think that the onus for that is on all of us, funders, government, practitioners, all of us who work within the sector, to be able to think of different ways of telling our stories. And from the very get-go, what we really need to do is look at our arts data. It exists, it's out there, but we need to figure out better ways of ensuring data literacy, and data utilization, so we can use it for our own selves to tell our stories. I think building up the evidence needed to incite our value is absolutely instrumental and something we need to get better at. And I think that we need to stop thinking about how we shift, how many bums are in seats, towards how art is bringing us together. What is it about the arts that creates social cohesion? How do we understand that and the value of that, and make other people outside of the arts understand that? So those are some of the things that are kind of coming up for me as to why we're still in a bit of a lag when there's all of the proof and evidence in the world of what we do in terms of their GDP for the country. But I do think we need to start moving away from that economic impact story and start talking more about all of the other amazing things that the arts do to contribute towards society, and just art on its own as a public good. I don't know, does anyone else have thoughts on that?
I see Olivia nodding her head quite vigorously here. So
yeah, I was just, it makes me think about programming and what you see at various organizations, whether it's here in Toronto or elsewhere. And I've definitely seen organizations trying to do things like the US, and not to do too much comparison, but I think that happens a lot with Canada and the US, especially because it's so close, and there's a lot of similarities in the way things are approached, but also different because the US is like, we're 10% of the US population wise. And just like the number of things I've seen where organizations are trying to mimic what the US is doing with programming and with artists, and I don't think it always works. Like you'll see shows. I've gone to shows at places, and there's almost no one there for a group that would normally sell out New York or Boston or Chicago. And you're like, there's always this element of community that I don't think is always brought into the picture, especially with programming. I've done some curation in the past, and a big thing is like, yes, you want international artists in as well, and diversifying the list of people you're bringing in, but also to remember to look back at community and what's happening in community right now and in this area. Anyways, I'm just thinking a lot about programming and how it relates to everything that you've all just kind of brought up, and where we need to keep also thinking about that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And it's calling to mind, like, I'm thinking about democratizing some of these spaces. Even the most privileged of persons has trouble finding time to go and carve out a space generally to go and see a show. And what I'm trying to do, what we're doing on Humber campus is something that I come up with called Campus as a Canvas, and that is, get it out of the white cube, get it out there, and make it all public art. Celebrate this stuff, make it part of the daily interaction, the community building, the markers for place and space that you recognize and cheer on. Massive opportunities for representation, right? Same thing, majority of the faculty and administrators at the college are older white folks, myself included, and the student population is not, right? And so there's a gap there. And I think in terms of healing and reconciliation, one of the big things people are like, oh, what is that? That's so overwhelming. It's like, just let people be seen. That's it, right? And I think some of these structures historically don't allow for that, right? Kate, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify what both you and Olivia said with some examples. Like I hope, I really, really hope that in this, I hesitate to say post-pandemic era, but let's say late pandemic era, that we as a Canadian society have a greater awareness of equity-seeking representation, and that there is a desire, a hope, a thirst to listen to those stories and to appreciate the novels, the plays, all of those cultural products more, and that there will be audiences looking for that. But I think your point, Olivia, about building community is so essential. Like we saw the impact with the lockdowns of losing those community or moving to a digital format for those communities, and how eager people are to move into those community spaces. But there's also this parallel requirement of making sure that those spaces are safe. And so I see, to finish off this idea, I see organizations like Canadian Stage who have the privilege of that wonderful space in High Park here in Toronto, and sharing that stage, because audiences are still quite timid, if you look at the data, in returning to closed indoor spaces, and they're wanting that community experience, but they want it probably in an outdoor space. And so I just see so much opportunity for privileged organizations who receive funding in the unjust system that we have that's full of barriers, for sharing the wealth, sharing the resources, like Canadian Stage has done in opening up that programming in High Park, and inviting musicians to come in, inviting dance artists to come in, and sharing that space a lot more than it ever has been. And I hope that we are looking at this new era of experimentation and a building of community, because we really need it.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that with another really great example, which is Why Not Theatre's Riser project, and which they have taken what you're basically describing, Kate, and been really creative and giving space to up and coming, emerging, extremely talented artists and arts groups, which are traditional conventional funding models may not have allowed otherwise. So I think that there's no secret here. Like, I think that the way that our funders are structured, and they all know, they're aware of this too, because it's hitting a ceiling that they have. There's a huge tension. There's there's organizations that receive core operating dollars. And then on the other hand, they have this EDI mission as well. So how can you offer both those things when there's only so much money in the bank? And I think that everyone recognizes this, that it's a real issue. So what is the creative solutions that we can come up with to make sure that there's still room for different individuals, groups, organizations to have access to long-term funding, just as those core institutions that have been receiving the funding for quite some time are getting. So what can be done, like that why not example, where an organization is able to potentially offer resources for that to occur. So I think that is something that really needs to be discussed, and it needs to be a conversation between the sector and funders on how to come up with some solutions, some creative solutions on how to go about rectifying some of those strains that our current model is having on us.
Thanks for that. I'm cooking up something with Pat Tobin, so I'll keep folks appraised as it moves along. Yeah, municipal funders are being a little more nimble on some of these pieces as well. I'm just riffing on the idea of what do we value and why, and we've had some excellent historical context here with some pieces that have been brought in around Massey, and like you said, it's 70 years later. Like, what is going on, right? And for me, I think a lot about, and even to be a bit of a provocateur against Sanjay's comment earlier this morning, he was saying, oh, the arts process is so mysterious. People think, you just, boop, you get this idea and then sparkles and this thing pops out of you, right? And I'm like, yeah, I do understand that, people don't understand, like who aren't inherently creatives or makers but like, I don't sit around and be like, oh, wow, brain surgery. Like, I really don't understand that process. Or like, ooh, like tax coding. Like, that's like, you know what I mean? Like, what is with this? And to me, it comes out of a space where the mythologizing of what we value has been so deeply ingrained in a lot of these areas. And to what, Olivia, you were speaking about with, essentially it's that old moniker, like, oh, it's great exposure. And it's like, that's what you die from. Thank you. No, we don't need the exposure. We need the value. And to see that value. And as you had mentioned as well, Robin, with the feminization of any industry comes an extreme devaluing in financial, in working conditions, and in everything else. And this is what has happened. Nursing used to be male dominated, teaching used to be male dominated. And then with World War II, these things became feminized. And then with culture production and everything else, you've got young female identifying workers there, for the most part, who are making $35,000 a year. How do you do that in Toronto, right? And then the CEO of the organization is making $350,000. Like, explain this disparity to me. This is very interesting. So I was just wanting to think about, do we have anything to say around those stories that are out there around value and how we can break those, perhaps using artistic lived experience, Olivia, other methodologies from different communities. Robin, you've referenced data and actually collecting data and making visualizations around that in a way that makes sense. And Kate, you may have something to say around policy there.
If I could jump in a little, just a couple thoughts kind of tagging on and then continuing. If you look at salaries for arts workers, especially in that kind of like, not even entry level, but like someone who maybe has 5 to 8 years of experience already, and is working for a theater company or a dance company or a music company, something like that, it's often stuck around this $45,000 range. Yep. And I've had numerous friends and colleagues who have done that for a while. They like being in the arts, but the problem is that you get stuck around 45,000. And then unless you can move up to something else, like if you decide you're the kind of person who wants to be an executive director or in a higher up leadership position, you can't really go anywhere. Like, there's no growth encouraged for administrators, which I think is kind of, which is frustrating from one level. And then, again, those are the people who are often supporting artists. So you're overworking the support for artists, and that's a huge issue that I just want to name. And then for artists themselves, it's obviously like there's a level of scarcity that is taught to people. Think about how many people graduate theater school, visual arts, music, dance, all the different art forms, and I'm not naming all of them. But how many hundreds of artists are coming out every year of just conservatories, let alone the people who are self-trained or coming from a different direction. And yeah, so there's this element of scarcity that is very much pushed, and I know organizations who have taken advantage of that, and that's where I care a lot about the values of an organization and what is important to them, because it defines whether or not I work with them, and whether or not I would support their work as well. But there's this great Indigenous composer, Raven Shakan, who one time he said to me, he's like, I always ask for 1.5 to 2 times the minimum fee, because he's like, I'm Indigenous, I'm going to play cultural teacher. I'm going to be one of the support systems in the room for the other Black Indigenous artists of color. Like, there's going to be all these other jobs that get put onto you. And he's like, because he's done that, for him, it's actually meant he's ended up like sort of like a filter. A lot of organizations say no, of course, because they're like, well, we're not going to pay that. But then the organizations who are really care about this person's work, and I'm just using him as one example, but who care about the work and are figuring out in advance like what they kind of need from things. Like, even when I've received commissions, I have like a whole list of questions. And one of the things I often ask is like, hey, is there a way when you're applying for this grant, can we apply for a little extra money so that if I need to talk to an elder or a knowledge keeper, like that space is available for me? And I've never had anyone say no. They don't think of these things, so they're not necessarily like aware, but I just asked for what I need. And I think, having been a producer in the past, I've seen the kinds of stuff that people ask for when they negotiate. And I don't think that kind of knowledge is being shared enough, especially with artists and freelance artists. And so the number of people I've known who've just ended up leaving or going in a different stream has been huge. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there. Kate, did you want to?
Yeah, sorry, Robin, do you mind if I jump in? Okay. People who know me know that I rant about this all the time. So where to begin? If you look at, and sorry, I'm being way too Toronto-centric today, but if you look at the Toronto Foundation, they do this report every year called Vital Signs. And in Vital Signs, they look at cost of living in the city of Toronto. And it's certainly not unlike, city of Montreal, city of Vancouver, probably a little bit more in the city of Vancouver. But the 2019, so again, this is out of date data. The 2019 report said it costs $69,000 a year, a salary of $69,000, to have a 1-bedroom apartment, maintain a 1-bedroom apartment rental in the city of Toronto. So think about all those jobs on Work and Culture, and I'm very grateful that Work and Culture posts the salary, but think about all those jobs in Work and Culture that are less than $69K. And so basically those employers are saying, sorry, we didn't get enough money in our grant, or we're not, as you said, Olivia, we're not in tune enough because our head is so down in the artistic process to know what a living wage is in the city of Toronto. And a hill that I will that I will die on is we need to move away from that scarcity mentality and do less. If the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that we're doing too much as an industry. We are not valuing ourselves. And I don't mean that at an individual artist level, because I see artists like you, Olivia, all the time recognizing their value and demanding all of those considerations that you were just talking about. But I see it at an organizational level, at an employer level, that they are not thinking about the well-being of their employees, part-time, full-time, contract, whatever. And they're not taking into account when they're creating their applications, when they're talking to their sponsors, when they're talking to their donors about decent living, about decent wages, about the wage disparity, because the problem that you just identified, Olivia, of people leaving the sector, we have a labor crisis. People are leaving the sector in droves because we're getting our, and this is where I want to sort of point to our municipal funders from this morning. We're getting our money from federal, provincial, and municipal levels, if we're so lucky to get the 3 levels. And they're also our competition for workforce, because why would you stay at that $45,000 job when you could do the same work over there at the city for like $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 for a coordinator position? So we're not keeping up as a sector with cost of living. And I think it comes exactly down to what you said, the scarcity mentality that exists. And I could rant on even more about, you know, intersectional feminism and buying into patriarchal values, but I won't. But I really think that we need to reassess all of our budgets as employers, looking at you, all those directors out there, and saying, what if the way that we constructed our budgets was people first? And that we need to make sure that all of our people are well taken care of as the first thing, and then we do programming second. Programming has to follow people power and, you know, caring for and supporting our people. Because if we can't do that as employers, what are we doing?
Yes, thank you. Lovely. Let's have some more rants, please. I was just reading an article, I think, over the weekend. It might have been on the BBC. It was somewhere, and it was talking about an ambition gap, right? And the ambition gap is most often felt by equity-seeking and equity-deserving groups, as well as women. I don't know. I'm a former recruiter in this. I've been in the cultural sphere for about 10, 15 years, did a lot of amazing work and met amazing folks in that. But I can't tell you the number of times I would cold call someone up. Even my colleagues at the, you know, in the industry, oh, I would never apply for that. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. I could never do that. Oh, no, that's too much. Maybe in 10 years, I can think about that. And it's like, this is the ambition gap that comes in, as you were saying, Kate, from patriarchal devaluation of, and imperialist and colonialist devaluation of certain groups, right? And it's like, we have internalized that mantra to the point where we don't apply for things the way that men do. We are overqualified often, and let me tell you, the applications I've seen from a lot of men, I'm like, where is this even? Like, this, what is this? So I think there's something there. So I don't know, Robin, like in terms of data and data collection and the work that you're doing with research and mass culture, is there any pieces there that could help combat these internalizations and these mythologies that I say have been floating around out there for decades now? Art is work, you know? Yeah, sometimes it has glitter on it, but it's work, right? So it's a thing, and it's work like any other work. You have to sit down and do it, and oftentimes it's boring, and it doesn't work out, but you keep at it, and then, you know, this thing comes out. It's like the produced artifact object experience is like the tip of the iceberg, and all this underneath is what goes into being able to have that production, or that piece of the little cherry on the cake that people seem to see. So yes, Robin, tell us about data and how mass is going about collecting.
And thanks for the opportunity, because I'm bound and determined to make data sexy. So here we go. Currently, we're working in partnership with an organization that has aggregated this incredible data set that would prove so useful to the sector if we are able to, if mass culture is able to raise the funds to be able to do what we want to do with it, and really immerse the arts community in how to utilize the data set, but then also how to for us to understand how they might see the usefulness of it. And so this data set is based on every charity has to submit something called a T3010 form, which is all of the fundraising information that the CRA collects on behalf of collects for on charitable organizations. And so the group that we're working with, called Capital W, they have aggregated all of this information of all charities. What they want to do with Mass Culture is they want to have us pull out just the arts information, and then also they have the capability of bringing together the non-for-profit data, and then by having this data set, better understand how arts organizations may use it. And so we are creating a participatory learning series so that we can share how to potentially use the data, but at the end of it, understand how they might see themselves using it to tell their stories. One really cool thing that it can do at a very basic level is provide salary comparisons. So this is something that I've often found myself kind of a couple of years here and there. One of my colleagues raises, wouldn't it be great if we all just shared what we made so that we could then understand if we're being underpaid or what the story is across the board? Well, this information could do that for us. So it's incredible. And that's just very basic of what this data set could do. It could also be able to tell us whether or not we are comparatively with other like-minded organizations or same-size organizations, fundraising or raising earned revenue in comparison to other organizations that we see are comparable to. Do we have a whole lot or a whole lot less of reserves shared in our accounts? Because we're constantly told when we're applying for grants that we can't have more than 25% of accumulated surplus. But that has to change, or at least the mentality around that has to change, especially since we're certainly headed towards austerity when it comes to the arts. So we need to think about how do we save for a rainy day? How do we make sure our staff and those who we're employing are going to be protected if we come into some type of turbulence? So I think we need to start thinking differently about how we manage our money, our budgets within arts organizations. And I think that we need to be more open with our data, be more interested in how it can work for us, how it can allow us to know ourselves better as a sector, because then I think we will be able to have a more balanced, stronger seat at the table when we're asked to go and sit around other tables such as public policy, all the different spaces that we're being asked to be a part of. I think that's something we really need to do to better understand ourselves, and maybe where we can get creative and look at other different ways of diversifying our revenues.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic. I was raised by a very intense labor organizer. So I'm hearing this and I'm thinking this sexy data is also going to be a unifier, right? Because that's part of how value is either protected by those who are in power or not, right? And it's this lack of disclosure. It's this lack of, we are taught and told, don't talk about salary. Ooh, that's dirty. You don't do that. That'll get you fired. That'll get whatever, right? So there's pieces there where they prevent, or try to prevent women sharing knowledge and lived experience and trying to figure out what the men are making versus what the women are making. And yes, there's been legislation that's coming to change all of that, but it's still it's still out there very heavily, right? Kate, I see your mic is off. And then after your comment, I'm going to flip us into the question about policy that Robin led us so perfectly into.
Great. I just wanted to add to your point about activism. I think another reason why we have been underfunded for decades is our focus on art making and not on speaking about art making and about the work that we do, and that there needs to be a much louder concerted effort in activism and advocacy for our sector.
Yeah, and I've been talking about this with folks, and it's like we've forgotten in some ways. There are exceptions out there, but we've forgotten how to organize as a community and how to advocate for these concerns. And transparency is something that's kept from folks in order to prevent some of those pieces happening, right? So it's all interrelated. So we're talking about, you know, value and how do we foster healthy societies, you know, in terms of education, wellness, entertainment, all of these various pieces. I would say community building is huge in there. So what are some of the policy consideration that needs to be taken into account to make arts sustainable and accessible to all? Robin's jumping right in.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right in because if people aren't aware, they should be. There is currently Senator Patricia Bovey and it's already gone through its second reading. It's called Bill S-208, an act respecting the Declaration on the Essential Role of Artists in Creative Expression in Canada. So as I said, it's already gone through its second reading in the Senate before it goes to the House of Commons. And if it's passed, it could really provide an opportunity to act as that foundational document that I think the sector really needs to almost act as a springboard for us to then investigate all of the other potential policy interests that we need to further explore, either go back and review, such as the status of the artist legislation or the creation of new things. So that, I think, is a very important piece that will allow us to, again, know ourselves better. It's important because, and it's a bit unconventional the way it's been put together, which is also really interesting. And it's because Senator Bovey spent a great deal of time consulting with hundreds of artists and arts organizations. So what this is it's something that contains our voices, many voices within the sector, to begin to have more deeper and more in-depth conversations when it comes to cultural policy. So that's something I think would be of great value for us to be able to move forward. Because there are all sorts of really exciting things, and I think that there's a lot of interest within the sector to find ways of working beyond the arts in partnership with others, such as health and climate. But I think that we need to focus on ourselves and get ourselves in somewhat of an order before we're able to reach our tentacles out and think about what kind of position we can play within those other sectors.
And just to add an example, I think the connection between our mental health and exposure to the arts, we all know it, but I think that the general public has experienced that intensely during lockdown periods. And I would like to see public shout out to PHAC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, it funds programs like, Participation, Take Your Bike to Work Week, stuff like that. Obviously, they've been doing a lot during the pandemic, but I would love to see them funding the arts and seeing the arts as absolutely essential to Canadians' well-being and to our mental health. And then I want to pass it over to Olivia by also saying there is so much money. We mainly get our money federally through the Department of Canadian Heritage, but there is a huge amount of funding through Indigenous services, and really valuing Indigenous storytellers as not just, you know, oh, that would be nice, but as like central to what it means to be Canadian and understand what it means to be Canadian in 2022. So I would love to see more funding, not just from the silo of the Department of Canadian Heritage, but from lots of other departments at the federal level. Olivia?
Yeah, and I really want to highlight, like, there's a number of artists who kind of already put in place their own, you know, at a smaller scale, their own policies to change even just the work environment for the artists that they're employing. Like, I love talking about Yolanda Bonnell, but I always really admire the work that is done on the productions that Yolanda and Cole Elvis often do together. And it's because, you know, taking into keeping in mind that, like, artists are often freelance or working another job to sustain themselves. Also, that everyone's coming from a different background, and that accessibility can look and look different for a number of different people. So things like, you know, being in productions where we have a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week has changed my life in so many ways. Like, now I have to keep asking for it because I'm not sure I can do a full 5 days anymore. It's just like, it's so taxing and you're so exhausted by the end of it. And I think that's another thing that, you know, I know it's been talked before. I think it's like Finland does that in their actual offices, and in a lot of companies do that. But even to do that for administrators, like, just this shift of like doing less and what it means for mental health, and that, you know, what can we put into a space to, and have it as policy, where it's like, when Yolanda had a show called Bug that came out a few years ago, and it was so beautiful. And what was so nice is that there was support built in for the audience. I know there's support part of the process. So, you know, you have social workers and mental health workers and people who specialize in just being there in case you need someone. Like, say you're having a panic attack during a show. It's like just those kinds of small things where it just makes the difference in how safe you feel, whether you're the audience, whether you're an artist, whether you're an administrator in the building. And it's so many grassroots groups doing this, or individual artists. And I really want to see larger groups adopting these things, but also making sure they're doing it in a way that isn't just to check the box, to just say like, look, we did it. It's like, no, we're actually thinking about what people need in these spaces.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's so much to be learned from arts-based practices. And I do think, like, I think one of the beautiful things within the sector is that process and how it's so transferable to other things. And I just think that there's a lot to be learned from our artists. And I think that I totally agree, Olivia. I think we should be looking to our artists and how they're practicing their work, how they're collaborating, because it requires such a collaboration and such a way of bringing people together in all sorts of different ways. I think we need to be drawing our attention to that particular process and what we can glean from it and share with ourselves, but then also with the broader public.
Well, with that, we have approximately 10 minutes left. This has been an extremely enjoyable conversation for me, and it seems like the audience is quite engaged as well. So I'd like to open the floor at this point. Comments from the audience, any provocateur statements, bring them on. Any questions? This is a great opportunity to have these 3 fantastic minds gathered in one place to share experience with. So let's open it up. So, first question, how is the narration around aesthetics and technical knowledge in the arts conveyed without actually taking away the authenticity of what arts truly means to the artists when exposing arts to the community and for free expression? Shika, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Unless I'm just looking a little, like, trying to get a little bit of a clear direction on like who are the aesthetics and technical knowledge conveyed to? Is that the concern? Just, you can pop it in the chat. Unless, you know, panelists, if you have a take, jump right in. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is talking about how do we take away the mystery of the artistic process, and, or, you know, I would even argue, why bother? But and then keeping the authenticity of that process, or what the arts bring when the arts are interacting with community. And I think you're also angling it toward what are the impacts on freedom of expression?
Right. Oh.
Yeah, support system related to policies and funding. Yeah, thanks, Chica.
I think I can come up with a perspective on this question as it relates to policies and funding. I don't think that we need to demystify. I agree with you, Jennifer. I don't think we need to demystify the creative process. In my conversations with politicians, they are never going to get it, and that's okay. What they need to understand is the impact of the arts, and that we need to talk about value, as we have for the last hour, talk about value and impact, and how not about bums in seats, but how, as Kevin Loring says, how stories are medicine. I'm probably quoting him incorrectly, but how we really value the work that artists do in our society. And I think it is easier to make that argument to funders and policymakers now after they've experienced lockdown, because the value of the arts, you know, sustained so many people. The lack of being able to gather in community face to face really impacted people's mental health, and we've seen those effects throughout our healthcare system. So it's much more tangible now. So I really don't think that we need to demystify, and I kind of agree that there's a little bit of value to that mystery, and that you know, that the magic of the arts shouldn't be demystified. It needs to it needs to coexist with the policy that values what happens there.
I'm also just gonna, because what I'm reading into this a little bit, this question is this instrumentalization versus just the aesthetics of the arts itself. And I think that with evidence, like robust, well-researched evidence, we can, in partnership with others, create many yardsticks in order to understand our impact. We don't necessarily just need to be qualifying everything by the bums and seats, but we can be looking at our impact in all sorts of other ways that I don't think would veer us too closely to arts as an instrument, but more so as all the other things that arts are able to do, and amplify that in all sorts of different ways, rather than just how many people do we bring into our audiences, and what have you. So I think all this to say that there are many different ways of understanding how arts can really play a strong and vital and important role within the sector, within the public.
I'm also a qualified teacher, you know, for visual art. And guess what I'm doing? I'm not teaching because there is no visual art teachers anymore, right? So there's all these types of things that, you know, and that's sort of what plays into those mythologies and those narrations around aesthetics and cultural practice, that it is a hobby, or it's a, it's not real work, right? It's something that you do on the side, right? But I think that the conversation here around the value lies in community building, right? And the value lies in everything that can occur there. Like we're having, as we've all spoken about today, a brain drain from the cultural industries because it's not sustainable on any front for many of the folks who are in those industries. Thank you. Yes, it is work. Yes, it is, all of it. But like I said, as a former recruiter too, one of the biggest sells that I would have with folks when I'd call them up was that, okay, well, tell me what Toronto's about. Tell me what that culture's about. And I would just go off, right? I've lived in a whole lot of places, and I choose to live here. That is in terms of deep and wide community building and bringing talent, bringing innovation, bringing all of these things back into the city, because the city is deeply concerned about brain drain as well to the states and various other places. The value at a policy level of what this can do, not just for this sector, and we look at it in wellness and sustainability across the board in what we collectively have values on. I think we just need to raise our voices. Parents, ask, demand, write letters. Do you want an art class? Do you want music classes back? Get on it. It's once again, we're not organized, right? And that has been the result of a lot of systemic pressures, I think, that have been out there. And I find the policy process a mystery. I don't know who comes up with it or how, or, where it kind of lives, or what any of that is, right? So to me, that's a big mystery too. But it's okay, well, we need to find out, and we need to get involved, and we need to make sure that, we have an artist here at the table in Olivia, right? To give that lived perspective so that these things are heard and established from the ground up. Great. I think we have a couple minutes here. Kyla Ross has a question. How much weight can we place on our Americanized culture, putting limitations on the perception that art has intrinsic value, compared to a more Eurocentric perception of the value of art, for example? So are you talking about, I'm finding some of these things kind of replicating a little bit, right? Are you talking about financial success versus access to culture, or places that haven't taken culture out of schools and various other things?
While we wait, I could kind of put a thought in. Just at least for me, seeing European artists, and I'm using European very broadly, but I just know, I know artists who live in France, and when they talked about the grant process there, or in Germany. Oh, I see Kyla's the value of art to happiness, quality of life. Yeah. I have a version of this conversation with people where, in Canada, the US, these places where, and I can't speak to Mexico because I don't know too much about the art scene there, but at least here, it's obviously the hustle, the grind, the mental burnout, and all these sorts of things. And then when I do talk to my friends who are doing very well in France or Germany, for example, it's because that there's a lot of grants placing more value on the early parts of process, and also the idea of stretching stuff out. And I know, at least from working in theater, even seeing in theater, there's a process and you take time, and opera is very similar. But then you get to other groups, within music, even sometimes the person writes the piece of music and then it's done, and they don't get to workshop it. They don't get to keep working on it and make it the best thing it could be. It's very much you got the money, this is your deadline, you got to get your report in by this date, it's done. But then if you do something bigger at a larger scale, then you're allotted more time. So, quote unquote. And I just noticed that difference, at least from conversations with people, where it feels like they have more time. It feels like, the idea of spending several years on a project is very normal and very welcomed. And it's not necessarily just a theater or opera. It's smaller scale things.
Yeah, just to add to that, Kyla, I think that we see within the Canadian context in Quebec, because culture and artists have a greater value, historically speaking, you see the funding levels. Like it's very clear. If you look at how much money is coming from municipal level, provincial level, you can see that being higher in Quebec. And I think that speaks to what Olivia was just saying about the French culture and what they've inherited from France. And as Anne has mentioned here, like Canada's system is a hybrid of the inspiration of the British Arts Council, as well as the philanthropic foundation system from the US. And so we're so product driven here in English Canada, 2 weeks and then let's get that show out there. So that is definitely a huge problem in English Canada, for sure.
Thanks for that share, Robin. That's great. Yeah, and I think to what Dr. Gary is referring to here as the commodification or the festivalization, as we were talking about earlier today, and as was mentioned in Zainab's keynote, right? That I worked in private art for a while, and I was like, I could go sell cars. Like, all I'm doing is selling high-end luxury items here. Like, seriously. And I was like, yes, I enjoy handling these items. I really do, because I love being around pieces of art. But also I was like, this is maybe not the most fulfilling place for me to be because of some of these processes, right? And then also, like, it kind of just hurts my heart because these amazing works of art would go into a private collection and they don't see the light of day anymore, So that luxury good mentality that's gone on is, and it's only for certain folks, it's very limiting. And I think that it's a really good conversation to be having around, once again, why are certain things valued in these ways, and how can we burn down the house in the parts that aren't working, and make something new here that has a lot of health and wealth, sustainably embedded into it. It does. There's a whole lot. I feel like we could be talking for days on this and it would be very exciting. And maybe we should, but this has been fantastic. I'd like to thank each of our 3 fabulous panelists here today who each brought a different perspective. And we are going to make policy and data hot. That will be happening. We're making t-shirts. It's going to be on. But in terms of a power segment, if you're able to stick around, please do join us for the next session. We have a pair of poets who are going to close us out with 2 amazing readings. One is Shelley Grace, who has just won an Emerging Artist Award with the Toronto Arts Council. She's a spoken word poet. Also that, like, she's not really emerging. She's been around for quite a while. But yes, she's now getting some really great recognition. So Shelley is going to close us out with a set that she has composed directly around some of these questions that we've been posing in Cultures Compass and in response to those, as well as a reading by the esteemed poet Pamela Mordecai. So please join us at 3:30.